Carlson, tonight in early 2009, more than 12 years ago, the Obama administration made a surprisingly, probably unprecedented accusation against Westchester County, New York, a pretty liberal place. According to the Obama administration, Westchester was an instrument of white supremacy, not the good liberals who live in Westchester, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, many others. No one accused them of being bigots. The problem was the buildings they lived in. All those single-family homes, row upon leafy row, set back from the street, well-tended lawns, mailboxes. Those were all examples of racism, literally structural racism. And the only solution the Obama people announced was much greater density, more subsidized housing complexes in Westchester, more high-rise apartment buildings, maybe some drug-addicted vagrants living on the sidewalk begging for change. Only if Westchester County became more like the Bronx could it become non-racist. Well, this was all something of a surprise to the people who live in Westchester, again, most of whom are dutiful liberals. They didn't realize they had a white supremacy problem. Between 2000 and 2010, for example, according to the census numbers, Westchester's Black and Hispanic population had risen by more than 50%. So how could the county be racist? It didn't seem to make any sense. In court, the Obama administration explained their reasoning. They singled out Westchester's practice of standard zoning. That referred to county regulations that restricted the height of certain buildings and limited the placement of sewers to protect the drinking water. It sounds reasonable. But according to the Obama administration, those were restrictive practices. Restrictive practices is a legal term that under civil rights law means they were racist. And because they were racist, the Obama administration withheld more than $20 million in federal funds from Westchester County. If the county wanted the money, it would have to construct 10,000 low-income, high-density, very non-racist apartments. So this battle, it didn't get a lot of news coverage, but it went on for all 8 years of the Obama administration. And in the end, to its credit, Westchester fought back because they could afford good lawyers, and they eventually won in court. But many places couldn't afford good lawyers. They're not as rich as Westchester, so they had to relent. Under pressure from federal ideologues, communities in Oregon and Minneapolis, for example, with very little news coverage, abolished single-family zoning. This all happened in recent years. The question is, why is it happening? The goal isn't to eliminate racism. The goal is to eliminate suburbs. So rather than improve the lives of people who live in crappy places, the idea is to destroy the lives of people who live in nice places. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to eliminate the suburbs? Well, there's a very clear political reason. Suburbs are typically purple politically. Republicans can win just as Democrats can. But if your goal is to make the country a one-party state, you'd want to change this. You'd want to make suburbs into cities. And if you did that, you'd win every time. Democrats win cities. Of the 10 biggest cities in the United States, Democrats run 9 of them. Of the 50 biggest, they control 2/3. That doesn't mean they're good at running cities. They're not. Many of our cities are on the verge of collapse. People are running away from them. But making cities better is hardly the point. Winning elections is the point. Democrats are happy to admit this. Here's Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts from yesterday. Watch.
Human and physical infrastructure. Progressives in Congress have been leading this fight. Care economy is infrastructure. Climate justice is infrastructure. Housing justice is infrastructure. Transit, public transit justice is infrastructure. And so these bold investments must be made to support workers and families in order for us to have a just, equitable, and robust recovery from this pandemic.
Housing justice. It sounds like a term that maybe Ayanna Pressley just made up. What does that mean? Well, if most people were asked, they would say it means you're not allowed to prevent people, regardless of what they look like or where they're from moving into a specific neighborhood. And that's true. That's been federal law for a long time, more than 50 years. You can't discriminate in housing sales, and you shouldn't be able to. But that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about something very different. She's saying if neighborhoods look different, then by definition, they're racist. If one is nicer than the other, you have to make it less nice, or else that's not equity. The Obama administration was on this early. In 2015, the Department of Housing and Urban Development under Obama issued a final rule on what it called affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, according to the HUD secretary at the time, Julian Castro, The Fair Housing Rule was simply intended to enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the law that makes it illegal to discriminate in housing sales or in renting on the basis of race. Again, that law has been on the book a long time, and it's not controversial. But that law also requires local jurisdictions that receive federal money to take steps to affirmatively further the goal of eliminating race discrimination in housing. This is a complex wordplay, but here's what it means. Under the Obama administration, HUD went one important step further. According to Julian Castro, the existence of, quote, concentrated poverty in urban centers as opposed to the suburbs constituted de facto evidence of racial discrimination. In other words, as long as there is a place that's poorer than the place you live is racist. That's insane. But on the basis of that assumption, they move forward. And local jurisdictions were told to eliminate single-family zoning and increase density in business districts. And if they didn't comply, they might lose millions of dollars in community development block grants from HUD. That was a very radical step, and most Americans were unaware it was even happening. And people who live outside the cities are very against it, including faithful Democrats. None of them were for that. If they wanted to live next to Section 8 housing, they would have stayed in the city in the first place. So people hate this idea. Suburbs are very complicated organisms, like everything humans build. They've developed over a century, in some cases more than a century, for good reason. To have federal ideologues come in and destroy them is very threatening to people. They're not for that. Again, even Democratic voters are not for that. And of course, Joe Biden understands that. He's not a genius, but he knows what people fear. So when asked about it during the last campaign, he lied. Watch Biden reassure you that it's racist even to suggest that he would want to change America's suburbs. Here it is.
Look what he's doing now, the president. He's trying to scare because an awful lot of suburbanites are now deciding they're going to vote for me, at least the polling data suggests, as opposed to him. And he's talking about, Biden's what he's going to do, he's going to send all these folks out to suburbia. They're going to end up with houses out in suburbia and apartments in suburbia.
Yeah. Well, a lot of suburban voters did vote for Joe Biden, partly on the basis of that claim that he wasn't going to send a lot of people to the suburbs, but that was a complete lie. Now Joe Biden is preparing to do just that. Now, at the time, his defense was that the HUD rule by itself was not enough to restructure and eliminate suburbs. Local communities that didn't want to comply with the rule could simply refuse HUD grants. They'd lose millions of dollars, of course, but they could survive. What Biden didn't say is that the HUD rule was just the first step. In his new infrastructure plan, which you can read online, and you should, Biden calls for dramatically expanding the federal government's power over suburbs. The plan calls for implementing the provisions of something called the Home Act. That was a bill first proposed by Cory Booker of Newark, who is a lunatic and reckless. That legislation goes much farther than anything the Obama administration even attempted. It would cut billions of dollars of federal funding to any local government with, quote, ordinances that ban apartment buildings from certain residential areas or set a minimum lot size for a single-family home. So you, under this law, if you're a town, are no longer in charge of how large your lot sizes can be. You have no control over anything. What's the point of having a local government at that point? But it goes farther. The Home Act doesn't simply cut off HUD funding to suburbs that don't comply with its equity rules. It prevents states from getting federal transportation grants of any kind if they refuse to allow high-rise apartments or other high-density zoning in their suburbs. And that's very different. Unlike a HUD grant, that is money that states have to have. They can't refuse it. States need federal transportation dollars to fix their streets and highways. And by the way, it is their money anyway. It was dutifully sent to Washington, it is every year, by citizens of their states. But the Biden administration is in no mood for negotiation with suburban homeowners. Screw them with their decent schools and crime-free streets, living in their little 1950s America. According to the principles of equity, those people must be bigots by definition. They're living better than people who live in densely populated cities are living, therefore we must crush them. This is not a conspiracy theory. Very soon it could be the law. Read the bill. Abolishing the suburbs is a major part of the Biden administration's infrastructure plan. That legislation is still being negotiated tonight, and it's not final, but already the media are rushing to defend it. What shills they are, what liars. Here's USA Today, for example. USA Today, the nation's largest, quote, newspaper, quote, Biden's proposal would award grants and tax credits to cities that change zoning laws to bolster more equitable access to affordable housing. A house with a white picket fence and a big backyard for a 4th of July barbecue may be a staple of the American dream. But experts and local politicians say multifamily zoning is key to combating climate change, racial injustice, and the nation's growing affordable housing crisis. Really? Because if you wanted to fix the affordable housing crisis, maybe you would prevent foreign governments from buying up residential housing stock, which they are doing, or BlackRock from buying up single-family homes and turning them into rentals. Maybe you would make some effort to loosen the housing market a little bit, but they're not doing that. They're doing just the opposite. So you may ask yourself, can the federal government really ban you from having a suburban home with a backyard, celebrating the 4th of July with your kids, all in the name of climate change and racial equity? Can they prevent suburbs from having roads if they don't build low-income housing projects? Well, under existing civil rights law, a plan like this only works if the feds can prove that your roads are somehow racist. And that is exactly the case they've been making right out in the open. Why has nobody noticed this? It's not just the Obama administration that says roads and buildings are racist. Pete Buttigieg is now saying it too. Watch this.
The interstate system was built to keep certain groups in and certain groups out. So it was built on a racist system, correct?
Yeah, often this wasn't just an act of neglect. Often this was a conscious choice. There is racism physically built into some of our highways.
Eisenhower's interstate highway system is now racist? Really? I-95 is? Route 5 is racist? Tell us how, Pete Buttigieg. Does he even believe that? No, no one believes that. Just like nobody believes that Westchester County is bigoted because it has rules about where you can put a sewer drain. It's not about racism. Stop with that. It's about power. For Democrats, the goal of this infrastructure plan is permanent control over the federal government. And for multinational corporations like BlackRock, the point is driving down the cost of homes even further and building more apartment high-rises in the suburbs. That has been the goal of the most powerful people in the world for some time. In fact, it was just a few years ago, it was 2016, that the World Economic Forum released a video explaining, and we're quoting, "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy." What's less clear is why more self-described conservatives, their job, by the way, is to conserve things like America's self-respecting independent middle class, aren't objecting to this. It's not clear they even notice it's happening. They're negotiating this bill. The future of the way Americans live is at stake. And you never hear them say that. Luke Rosiak of the Daily Wire has noticed. He's been covering this story, maybe more intensely than anybody. He joins us tonight. Luke, thanks so much for coming on. So, at the core of this, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and expand on this one sentence, but at the core of this legislation is a total remake using federal power of the way millions of Americans live. Am I overstating that?
No, you hit the nail exactly on the head. Zoning is the most basic thing that local governments do. Towns know which area should be sort of the town square, the quaint little village where you can walk places, which should have more of a natural feel where you preserve, trees and big yards. And the federal government has no role in this. In fact, if residents of those towns wanted to change their zoning to do the kind of things that you talked about, they could have done so. They don't. The voters don't want it. And so the federal government is now printing money and bribing local officials to betray their own constituents with these stimulus funds. No one wants this. It's really important to say people of both parties like living in the suburbs. That's where they move there. The majorities of every racial group choose to live in the suburbs. The majority of immigrants choose to live in the suburbs. And so Democrats have been talking for decades about urbanism and mass transit, and it's going to be so efficient if we can all live in these stack and pack concrete jungles because you won't have to run the utility lines as far. It'll be very efficient and things like that. And now they're suddenly reversing course, and they're saying, you know what? it's actually bad to live in cities. There's a lot of minorities there, and it's not fair that they have to live there because they're very undesirable. It's hot and crowded, and the concrete really heats up in the summer, and it's not fair. They don't have nature. So let's all take them and put them all in the suburbs. How are we going to fit them all? With large buildings. So it really is equity in action. Equity means forced equal outcomes by taking the worst outcome that no one would want and making sure everyone has it. And so
well, that's it right there. Because like if you're mad about Lake Forest, why don't you fix Chicago? If you hate New Canaan, why not fix Brooklyn? Like why don't they fix things rather than destroy them?
Right, and there's no indication people from the suburbs want to go live in people from the inner cities want to go live in a housing project plopped down in the middle of a single-family neighborhood. Exactly. But what this bill would do, two things. You can put apartments anywhere. In single-family neighborhoods, your next-door neighbor's lot could literally be turned into a town or to an apartment building, or let's say you live on like a 1/10 of an acre where that's too small. Maybe that's why BlackRock is buying up entire neighborhoods. You buy 3 or 4 of those and you consolidate them and you build an apartment building. The second thing is historically people have different preferences. Some people prefer convenience, some people prefer privacy. And so people have 1 acre, 1/4 acre. This is all going to be doubled. They're dramatically increasing the population density with no debate.
It's shocking. Any Republican who votes for this ought to be primaried for real. Luke Rosiak, thanks so much for joining us. So Joe Biden told us recently that the single gravest terror threat we face is not Islamic terrorism, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, as the government has told us for 20 years now, since 2001. It's not the brutal mobs of race extremists who burned and looted our cities last summer, BLM and Antifa, as if you'd been paying attention, you would assume it would be. Of course, they're the ones who burned the cities. No, it's none of that. The main threat we face as a nation, Biden told us, is white supremacy, white American terrorists. And our law enforcement and intelligence agencies have concluded that. The president said it's an established fact. And then he stopped. Strangely, that's all that Biden told us. He never said who those white supremacists were. He didn't explain what they believe or what they plan to do to America. He announced no arrests of any of them. He didn't name a single person or organization. So who is the white Osama bin Laden? Joe Biden didn't say. Neither did his Attorney General, Merrick Garland, when he reiterated Biden's claims several days later. So the rest of us were left to wonder, who exactly are these domestic terrorists? We still don't know the answer, and neither do many longtime FBI agents, as we learned this weekend when we spoke to a couple of them. Biden's claim is absurd, they told us. It's not even close to true. In recent years, there have been so few crimes committed by avowed white supremacists that the FBI strongly considered dismantling the office within the Domestic Terror Division that investigates white supremacist groups. As the agents we spoke to put it, the number of cases the program manager had didn't justify his position. There was nothing for him to do. For decades, by contrast, the greatest domestic terror threat has come from radical environmental groups. They commit the most crimes. Look it up. White supremacists, meanwhile, are at the bottom of that list, and federal statistics prove it. Americans are, in fact, much more likely to die from a lightning strike than at the hands of a white supremacist. White supremacy may be ugly, many opinions are, but it is not a meaningful threat to the nation, and claiming otherwise is a lie. So why does the Biden administration persist in telling that lie? Well, it's a racial attack, obviously. It's waged for partisan political purposes. You tell black voters that Republicans are the KKK, and maybe they will keep voting for you. That's the idea. It's certainly easier than fixing Chicago or raising test scores, which they should be doing. But there's also a deeper significance. The Biden administration is signaling a very real change to actual federal policy. The war on terror, now ongoing for 20 years, has pivoted in its aims. The war on terror is now being waged against American citizens, opponents of the regime. We saw this on display on January 6th. We told you a couple of weeks ago, based on language in publicly available indictments, that the FBI clearly had foreknowledge of the riot at the Capitol that day. And the agents we spoke to this weekend confirmed that is true. Quote, the FBI had sources in that crowd, confidential sources, snitches. That's 100% certain. But it's not just political protesters the government is spying on. Yesterday, we heard from a whistleblower within the U.S. government who reached out to warn us that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take the show off the air. Now, that's a shocking claim, and ordinarily we'd be skeptical of it. It's illegal for the NSA to spy on American citizens. It's a crime. It's not a third world country. Things like that should not happen in America. But unfortunately, they do happen, and in this case, they did happen. The whistleblower, who is in a position to know, repeated back to us information about a story that we are working on that could have only come directly from my texts and emails. There's no other possible source for that information, period. The NSA captured that information without our knowledge and did it for political reasons. The Biden administration is spying on us. We have confirmed that. This morning, we filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, asking for all information that the NSA and other agencies have gathered about this show. We did it mostly as a formality. We've also contacted the press office at both NSA and the FBI. We don't expect to hear much back. That's the way that usually goes. Only Congress can force transparency on the intelligence agencies, and they should do that immediately. Spying on opposition journalists is incompatible with democracy. If they are doing it to us, and again, they are definitely doing it to us, they are almost certainly doing it to others. This is scary, and we need to stop it right away. Farmland is vital. You need it to eat, but you'll never guess who owns most of the farmland in the United States. It tells you a lot, and we'll tell you who it is straight ahead. Liberals like Joe Biden, who invented the term Latinx to take the gender out of it. It's an attack on a culture. It's not just patronizing, it's hostile. And the people it's aimed at don't like it. So why don't you stop it? Please. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff oversees the entire U.S. military. It's a big job, a lot of weapons, the fate of the nation resting on his shoulders. In the case of the Joe Biden administration, and by the way, the Trump administration, same guy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a man called Mark Milley. At a hearing this week, Milley explained that he is deeply concerned about something, not the threat from China, not the state of readiness among the troops. No. He's concerned about white rage. He didn't explain what that is, but he said it's a huge problem. White rage. Watch.
I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university, and it is important that we train and we understand, and I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it.
So let's be really clear. White rage is not a medical condition. It's not even a legitimate academic theory. It doesn't exist. White rage is a racial attack. It's an attack against people on the basis of their skin color. So here you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a congressional hearing leveling a race attack against American citizens. The guy is supposed to be protecting our country. That is disgraceful. It's disqualifying. It's without precedent. When was the last time that happened? And not only is it okay to complain about it, it ought to be mandatory. We shouldn't have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who attacks Americans based on their skin color. It's disgusting. Sean Parnell served in Afghanistan. He's a decorated combat veteran. He's now running for the United States Senate from Pennsylvania. He joins us tonight. Sean Parnell, thanks so much for coming on. So there is this feeling, even among Republicans, that if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff comes out in a hearing and all of a sudden starts attacking people because of their skin color, you're just supposed to ignore it because he's a general and you're not. Shut up. Do you think we should ignore this?
Yeah. No. If you were looking for a way to destroy the United States military from the inside out without firing a shot, talk about what he's talking about and implement critical race theory. It's a disaster. It's dangerous. It makes it harder to accomplish the mission. And ultimately, I think it will cost lives on the battlefield. I was blessed to lead an infantry platoon on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. We were probably the most diverse unit that you could possibly imagine. Northerners serving next to Southerners, black next to white, Christians next to atheists, next to Jews, rich next to poor, young versus old, and yeah, Democrats next to Republicans, right? But we didn't focus on our many differences. There were no hyphenated Americans with us in Afghanistan. And what we realized our secret weapon wasn't the sexy guns and equipment that we had. It was the love and brotherhood that we had for one another that allowed us to defeat the enemy at every single turn. Tucker, critical race theory undermines all of that. It's a disaster. When men and women raise their right hand to serve this country, they do so because they believe that America is an exceptional nation worth defending. Critical race theory undermines that because it teaches people that America is fundamentally bad, it's evil, its systems need to be reinvented because at their core, well, they're racist. That, Tucker, is a national security threat. And what truly bothers me is the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff should be focused on an exit strategy in Afghanistan. Been in Afghanistan for 20 years, over half of my life. And instead, he's reading Lenin, Marx, studying critical race theory. How about we get an exit strategy in Afghanistan? How about we focus on bringing our men and women home and taking care of them when they come home? Because, Tucker, if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs does not recognize the threat, the caustic nature of critical race theory and the threat that it poses to our military, then I think that he should consider resigning.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I love your point that our military is successful because it's that people who are in a lot of ways different are united in a mission as Americans. And when you fray those bonds, when you force people to focus on what divides them, you're a less effective fighting force. I mean, since you put it that way, it makes a lot of sense. Why wouldn't he know that?
Yeah, critical race theory is a threat because it divides people into little groups, and it undermines trust on the battlefield. And if there's no trust on the battlefield, when the bullets start cracking by your head, I mean, there's hesitation. That hesitation leads to death on the battlefield, right? Soldiers need to be able to come together, look past their many differences. In fact, that's part of the training. So critical race theory needs to go away. In fact, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle need to act. We should ban critical race theory from the military yesterday.
Amen. Really quick, looking from the outside in, the U.S. military seems like by far the least racist institution in American life and has been for many decades. Is that, yeah, right? That's the way it seems in a great way.
It's absolutely true. We have been a colorblind culture in the United States military for almost 200 years. We've gotten a lot of things right. Keep your politics and your social experiments out of our military, and let us focus on what we were always intended to do, protecting the United States of America and winning wars.
Yeah. Sean Parnell, so nicely put. Thanks for coming on tonight. Good luck in your race.
Thanks, sir. You got it.
Well, the evidence of the revolution around us is everywhere, erasing history, renaming schools, tearing down statues. What is going on here? Well, they're trying to build utopia. That's actually what it is. We had a fascinating conversation with Angela Nagel, who's a historian and a pretty deep thinker, about that question. That's next.
Title lock.
The difference between the modern left and the modern right, if you're being totally honest about it, is the modern left is a little bit deeper. They don't just attack policies, they attack history. They tear down statues, they rename schools. They try and change the national memory. They make people disavow their own ancestors. Why do they do that? Angela Nagel is a figure on the left. She's looked into that question. You can find her work on Substack. We talked to her at length for the latest episode of Tucker Carlson Today. Here's her central insight. What they're trying to do is bring about utopia. What happens then? Here's part of the conversation.
That's sort of like catastrophic to put it this way, but if this utopian project falls at some point, they didn't change the flags, right? They didn't change the name of the country. They did that in the Soviet Union. They didn't do it here. But it is still a utopian project. It is still a social experiment in a totally new set of modern values. which is much more hell-bent on removing every single remnant of the past, of the old society. And if this, you know, if the only thing holding this together is consumer society in a way, right? And if that fails, if there's some economic catastrophe or something like that, what of the old society will remain? Will too much time have passed? Will the destruction have been too complete, or will it reemerge? I mean, it's hard.
So it used to be that the United States has, you know, for 100 years been fundamentally a consumer society, but it also was undergirded by the founding documents and the civil society they gave birth to.
But it wasn't a consumer society in the way that the Cold War meant that there was basically a blank check for science, right? And, you know, any amount of money on like nuclear project or space projects or whatever was given to, and so as a result, there was this massive technological advancement. And the capability, and remember also America emerged from World War II as the, you know, the industrial society with the least damage done, you know, to its productive capacities, which is why it became the superpower. And, you know, so that consumerism on that scale had really never been seen in the world before. I mean, people bought things, people traded things, but consumerism on the scale that became normal in that Cold War period, you know, was unique in human history.
So has any utopian project ever succeeded that you're aware of?
Well, this is the only one that still stands, so we will have to see.
Where do you think this is going?
I mean, I do think that, you know, I think that the case that I was making, that consumerism is the thing holding a lot of this together, I think that if that fails, the fact that the current government have in peacetime done the spending that they have is actually kind of unheard of. And so I think on some level they understand that economics is that when you remove everything else, when you do not allow a society to have hold anything sacred, have any moral values, have any traditions, then you have kind of gutted the whole basis of society, the framework for meaning in life, and all you have is economics. And so the economics can't be allowed to fail. And so they are just going to keep pumping money at this thing until, for as long as they possibly can. In terms of what happens to the left, I don't really see any hope there.
Angela Nagle was on the left for a long, long time, and then she woke up one morning and realized, wait a second, they don't care about people at the bottom. All of a sudden, they're promoting sex work and open borders. How does that actually help people? She's had quite a transformation. The full conversation at Tucker Carlson today. It's on FoxNation.com.